Hello everyone, a very good evening to all of you. So let's begin today's session on environment and ecology, and the topic today is some of the international conventions and international agreements that have been taken, implemented as a part of stabilizing the earth against climate change. So in yesterday's class, we looked into some of India's contributions and what is India's stand on climate change and what are the measures taken by the government of India in this regard. All right, but along with that, there are plenty of international conventions and international bodies, etc., which works towards the same thing for to make sure that the climate change impacts are minimized or the climate change does not happen in alarming rate. Okay, so what are these organizations and what are these say agreements and say rule books that have been framed as a part of such international conventions? This is what we are going to look into in today's class. So obviously this is a very lengthy topic. So I have splitted this into two. Half of it I will take today. The remaining half will be taken tomorrow. Okay, I mean, I could have taken the full thing today, but already it is a very dry topic because it's all about international conventions and treaties and their specific rules and laws and all. So if I take the whole thing today, it will be like it will be too much. All right, you will already become saturated by the first 30 minutes or so. So I do not want to extend this class beyond 1 hour. So the idea is to split the class into two, and half of it is taken today, the other half is taken tomorrow. So in today's class, we will see all the way from the beginning, of the formation of UNFCCC up to the Marrakesh Treaty, or I think up to the Glasgow Treaty. Okay, maybe not up to the last one, but at least up to COP to 2017 we will cover. Okay, the remaining we will take in the next class. So, welcome to this channel. If you are new here, please make sure to subscribe to Madhav Sankar classes, and please do like this video and share with your friends. Okay, so climate change organizations, part 1. So UNFCCC, you might have heard about this organization at the beginning of your preparation itself. Correct? So how did this organization come to be? What is the role of this organization? How important is this organization in the context of climate change? All that is going to be covered. So the United Nations Summit Conference on Environment and Development, known as UNCED, okay, held a summit in Rio de Janeiro in the year 1992. Okay, during this summit, all the parties, by consensus, formed the first multilateral legal instrument on climate change. And this came to be known as United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. This is how the organization started back in 1992. Okay, so in 1992, plenty of countries joined UNFCCC. They agreed to cooperate in the area of limiting the global temperature that is causing all this climate change, okay, to take all the mechanisms necessary to reduce the impact, etc., etc. And UNFCCC Secretariat was also set up to support all the institutions involved in the international climate change negotiations. All subsequent multilateral negotiations on different topics related to climate should include or should be based on the principles and objectives set out by UNFCCC. All these decisions were taken back in 1992. Okay, there could be multilateral or say bilateral treaties on climate, etc., etc. But the basis of all these should be on the principles of UNFCCC. Okay, so this became an umbrella organization which looks into the climate change and its impact, its adaptation, its mitigation, etc., etc., in a global perspective. Okay, so this was the beginning of all the climate change actions that has taken place over the upcoming decades. But the problem was, by 1995, 3 years later, the countries understood that the emission reduction provisions of this convention, this UNFCCC, was not adequate. Okay, it was not enough. Climate change is a real thing and it is happening so disastrously. At that time, this ozone hole and all were, extremely alarming. Clear. So they understood that this is not enough. We have to do much more than what has been, agreed upon in UNFCCC. So what did they do? Another meeting was held. Another conference was held in Kyoto at Japan. Okay, at a place called Kyoto in Japan in 1997. And the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. Okay, the very famous Kyoto Protocol. This is basically COP3. COP stands for Conference of Parties. Okay, so this was the third conference of these parties, and it adopted the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol had some stringent measures and all. So naturally, it took a lot of time before it was ratified by enough countries. And finally, after all kinds of ratifications, Kyoto Protocol entered into force on 16th of February 2005. So although it was adopted back in 1997, only 8 years later did Kyoto Protocol come into force. Why? Because of its stringent measures and all. It took a lot of time before everybody accepted it. It ratified it. So Kyoto Protocol basically is the operational part of this convention. Okay, UNFCCC is a convention. It is an agreement. It's not legally binding, or it doesn't commit anybody to anything. Okay, but Kyoto Protocol is much more stringent, much more concise, much more precise. The main difference is that while the convention encouraged industrialized countries to stabilize the global greenhouse gas emissions, protocol commits them to do so. So in the convention, it was merely an agreement. So it encouraged these industrialized countries to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. That's all it did. There was no stringent measure or penalties or anything for non-compliance. But protocol was much more strict, much more severe. It made these industrialized countries to commit to their contributions. Got it? So it became much more forceful rather than some loose voluntary agreement. Kyoto Protocol, or KP as it came to be known as, sets binding emission reduction targets for 37 industrialized countries and the European community in its first commitment period. Okay, so there were different commitment periods for Kyoto Protocol. So in the first commitment period, which lasted up to 2012, the Kyoto Protocol set binding emission targets for the 37 industrialized countries along with the European community. Okay, it recognizes that these industrialized nations are actually responsible for the current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, because of the fast industrialization or unplanned industrialization that happened in these countries, it's because of that the world is suffering like this now. So they are supposed to be more responsible for this climate change than the developing and underdeveloped countries. So Kyoto Protocol officially recognized this. Okay, so because of this recognition, it set out something known as CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibility. Yesterday I mentioned about this, common but differentiated responsibility. Everybody has this common idea, everybody has this common responsibility. That is to act against climate change, to take measures to prevent climate change. But their responsibilities are differentiated. It is based on the principle of equity, which means those who have benefited the most because of overexploitation, etc., in the past, they should be held more responsible than the countries which did not get a chance to do that at that time. Okay, so the CBDR, or the Common but Differentiated Responsibility, this came to be the pillar of Kyoto Protocol. And initial agreement was after an average of 5% emission reduction was supposed to happen compared to the 1990 levels over the first period between 2008 to 2012. That was the initial commitment. It changed later on during the second commitment period and all. Okay, so what are the features of this Kyoto Protocol? How does the protocol aim to implement all these things? There are three major features. First one, reporting and verification procedures. Okay, I told you this is a binding agreement and it has severe, stringent measures to do so. So it is very important that all the actions taken by the industrialized nations and all the parties should be properly reported, and also it should be verified. Second one, flexible market-based mechanisms. What are they? I will explain to you in the upcoming section. Then a compliance system. These three are the three main features of Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so starting with emissions reduction commitments. The first was, this was a binding emission reduction commitment for developed countries. It is not for developing or underdeveloped nations. It is for developed nations. Okay, the greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, started to become a new commodity. Okay, everything was measured based on carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. I talked about it during our session on carbon trading and all. I hope you remember. Clear. So carbon became a commodity all of a sudden, and everything was based on carbon equivalents. Now, flexible market mechanisms. What is this? What is this flexible market mechanisms? Basically, trade of emission permits. Okay, all the countries, or say the developed countries especially, according to Kyoto Protocol, they were bound to targets that were supposed to be met largely through domestic action. Okay, by domestic policies, that country was supposed to meet their targets, binding targets. But there was another catch. There was another way to meet these targets. How? This is known as market-based mechanisms. Okay, there are three market-based mechanisms I will explain to you. So ideally, this is this mechanism works by a developed country investing or helping a developing country or an underdeveloped country in setting up of green technology, or say in abating pollution or something like that. Okay, so rather than implementing a domestic policy, the developed country can implement various technology measures in order to prevent greenhouse emissions in developing parts of the world. This is based on what is known as market-based mechanisms. There are three market-based mechanisms. I will tell you in the upcoming slide. Okay, so what are the Kyoto Flexible Market Protocol mechanisms? These are: number one, joint implementation; number two, the clean development mechanism; and number three, emission trading. Emission trading we already covered in our previous classes, but I will quickly explain it. First of all, joint implementation. What is this joint implementation? I will read through this first and then explain. Joint implementation allows a country with an emission reduction or limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol, that is the Annex B party or a developed country, to earn emission reduction units, ERUs, from an emission reduction or emission removal project in another Annex B party, each equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide, which can be counted towards meeting its Kyoto target. So basically, in a joint implementation setup, an Annex B party means a developed country. Okay, developed countries are put in an Annex B list. So an Annex B party can jointly implement some projects that could reduce the emission or say limit the emissions in another Annex B party, which means in another developed country. Okay, this joint implementation projects will also count to the parties' commitment to the Kyoto Protocol. So say for example, two developed nations, US and Britain, they decide that they will together implement a project in say Britain. Such implementations are known as joint implementations. So the host party benefits from foreign investment, technology transfer, job creation, etc., etc. And the country that is actually investing in the other country, that country has contributed its part in the Kyoto Protocol. So both are benefiting. So this is joint implementation where both the countries are developed countries, part of Annex B. Second one is clean development mechanism. Here the difference is that one party is the Annex B country and the other party are the developing countries. So the Annex B party or the developed country agrees to implement emission reduction projects in the developing country. Got it? In joint implementation, both are developed countries. In clean development mechanism, one is a developed country and the other one is a developing country. Clear? So by implementing such projects in a developing country, the developed country will get certified emission reduction credits or CERs, which is again counted as a part of their Kyoto commitments. Okay, third one, carbon trading. This we have already looked into in previous classes. I hope you remember. Basically, this is an exchange of emission permits. Within carbon trading, there is two types. First one is emission trading or cap and trade mechanism. Second one is offset trading or the baseline and credit trading. I had explained both these mechanisms in previous classes. I hope you have listened to it. In emission trading, what happens is emission permit is known alternatively as carbon credit. For each Annex 1 country, the protocol has assigned a fixed amount of carbon emission in the agreement. Okay, for each Annex 1 country, which means in this case, for each developed countries, the protocol has assigned a fixed carbon emission, fixed amount of carbon emission in the agreement. Okay, so this number which is indicated is actually the amount of emission which should be reduced by the concerned country. Okay, whatever number is denoted in this agreement, that is the amount of carbon emission that should be reduced, which means the remaining carbon emission is permitted. Okay, so this remaining carbon emission is basically the allowance or basically a credit given to that country. They can, emit that much. This is known as cap and trade mechanism or emission trading mechanism. Clear? And this whatever is remaining, the units are this total amount of allowance is subdivided into certain units, and the units are expressed in terms of carbon equivalent. Each unit gives the owner the right to emit 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or other equivalent greenhouse gases. Clear? So if if that particular company or if that particular country can achieve something that is way less than that, then they can actually trade the extra credits for something else. I had mentioned about that stock market, carbon commodity trading and all in previous classes. I hope you remember. This is emission trading or cap and trade mechanism, giving that allowance for the country to emit, as much as they want up to that limit. Second one is offset trading or baseline credit trading. What is this? Here, how it works is by investing some amount of money in such projects known as carbon projects, which will emit lesser amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Okay, so suppose there is a project that actually emits 800 tons of carbon dioxide. You are implementing a project whereby only 400 tons are emitted. So you are actually preventing the emission of another 400 tons carbon dioxide equivalent, correct? So this extra can actually be traded. Okay, so this method is known as offset trading or say baseline and credit trading. These are the two types of carbon tradings that can take place in order to prevent or in order to limit the carbon dioxide equivalents that enter the atmosphere. So as I have mentioned, Kyoto Protocol is a binding protocol, and it is a very stringently and strictly formulated protocol, which naturally means if a country do not comply with this Kyoto Protocol, then there will be penalties. There will be punitive measures. Okay, so what are they? If a country does not meet the requirements for the measurements and reporting, the said country loses the privilege of gaining credit through joint implementation projects. Okay, so non-compliance means the points that or the credits that were supposed to be earned through joint implementation mechanism will not be allowed. That privilege is taken away. Second one, if a country goes above its emission cap and does not try to make up the difference through any of the mechanisms available, then that country must make up the difference plus an additional 30% during the next period. Clear? In the first period, in one period, if that country fails to achieve its target, so if that country emits an amount that is beyond their limit, then whatever is emitted extra plus another 30%. That extra commitment should be made in the next period. Okay, very stringent measures. Third one, the country could also be banned from participating in the cap and trade program. That's also there, which means they cannot trade on this carbon trading platform. Clear, that ban can also be imposed. So such stringent measures were taken under Kyoto Protocol, and this is one of the most legally binding programs, or maybe the implemented since the 1990s. And its first period was between 2008 and 2012. The first commitment period of Kyoto Protocol, which came into force in 2005, was between 2008 and 2012. What happened was, by 2012, that commitment period came to an end. And what next? That is the question. Correct. So you have to have a plan for what happens in 2012 onwards. And Bali Meet answers this question. Bali Meet was the meeting of 190 countries. Those are part of the United Nations Treaty on Climate Change that was held in 2007. Okay, so in 2007, 190 countries who are parties to the United Nations Treaty on Climate Change put their heads together to work out on what are the countries expected to do after the first phase of Kyoto Protocol ends in 2012. Okay, so in this meet, in the Bali meet, the developed countries said that after 2012, even the developing countries like India and China, which are increasing their emissions, as they are growing, they also should take some kind of emission cuts. Up till this point, it was only the developed countries doing all the job. But developed countries said from 2012 onwards, all the nations, including the developing countries like India and China, should start their own contributions and should take part in some kind of emission cuts. So in order to implement all these things, something known as a Bali roadmap was prepared. Basically, a 2-year process to finalizing a binding agreement in 2009. The next meet after Bali, or the meet that was supposed to take place in 2009, was set up in Copenhagen. Okay, this is known as the Copenhagen Summit. So in 2009, at Copenhagen, some kind of a binding agreement was supposed to be created. And a pathway to do that was put forth in the Bali meet. Okay, and this included a Bali action plan, an ad hoc working group on further commitments. Similarly, the launch of Adaptation Fund, decisions on technology transfer, all these things were put forth in the Bali roadmap. And finally, the COP15 or the Copenhagen Summit took place in 2009. Okay, Denmark. The Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark. So the Copenhagen Summit came to take place in 2009. The problem was the Copenhagen Summit failed to come up with a binding agreement. Okay, why? Because there were huge disagreements between developing and developed nations. Clear? So at the end of the summit, the only thing that came out was what is known as Copenhagen Accord. Copenhagen Accord is basically a non-binding agreement which was put forth by BASIC and the US. Okay, BASIC is a group of 5 nations, and along with BASIC countries, US also joined this. So this was put forth by these 6 nations together. Which are the BASIC nations? I hope you know. I had put a question regarding the BASIC nations in my Telegram channel as a part of the Hindu quiz. If you have attended it, you would know what BASIC countries are. Otherwise, go find it out. Okay, it's another topic, so I'm not going into that. But anyway, Copenhagen Accord put forth by these BASIC and US came to be a very non-binding agreement. Under this accord, developed countries agreed to set targets for reductions in their greenhouse emissions by 2020. Okay, specific targets, concrete targets, purely based on numbers and statistics, etc., etc., rather than some very vague targets. So developed countries agreed to do that. Developing countries agreed to pursue nationally appropriate mitigation strategies to slow the growth of their emissions. but are not committed to reducing their carbon output. That is the keyword. Developed countries have their commitment. They have to agree to set targets, on reductions and all. Developing countries, they also should pursue nationally appropriate mitigation strategies. That is, within their own country, they can come up with, say, their own targets, etc., and try to, keep up with that. But no commitments. Okay, not committed to reducing the carbon output. That is the key point in the Copenhagen Accord. Clear? Also, it recognizes the need to establish a mechanism to enable the mobilization of financial resources from developed countries to help achieve this. These developing countries obviously need a lot of finances in order to achieve these kinds of targets. So, developed countries agreed to, a mechanism had to be set up for a smooth flow of cash from developed countries to the developing countries. Clear? So this RED plus, for now, just skip this. I will explain what RED plus is in the next class. Okay, we are definitely looking into RED plus. It's another, group which is based on climate action. I will explain that in the next class. Developing countries, especially these with low emitting economies, should be provided incentives to continue to develop on a low emission pathway. Agrees a goal for the world to raise $100 billion per year by 2020. So the developed countries together, or the world as a, the whole together, should put up a fund of $100 billion by 2020 for all the climatic for all say measures implemented to prevent the climate change. Okay, so these were the targets of the Copenhagen Summit. What happened after the Copenhagen Summit? What happened was, we still do not have a binding agreement. Kyoto Protocol, the commitment period came to an end in 2012, the first commitment period, correct? But after that, what happens? After 2012, we do not have any proper, say, binding agreements. Okay, so this vacuum has to be fixed somehow, correct? So COP16 happened in Cancun, known as the Cancun Summit. So Cancun Summit included decisions under both the convention and Kyoto Protocol. Okay, the initial UN Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, both were taken together for discussion. And all parties, to the convention have agreed to support or say report their voluntary mitigation goals for implementation. All parties, developing countries and developed countries, all were supposed to report what are the actions that were taken by them for achieving their contributions. Industrialized countries, targets were officially recognized, and these countries are to develop low carbon development plans. They were supposed to report their inventories annually. Same for developing countries also. They were also given, their action plans were also officially recognized. A registry was set up to record and match developing country mitigation actions to finance and technology support from the industrialized countries, which means basically a record where one developing country is matched with a developed country. Okay, if a developing country is coming up with a particular plan to reduce the emissions, then a developed country which is ready to finance that action is matched with that. Clear? Such a record was kept. Similarly, developing countries are to publish progress reports every 2 years. All these decisions were taken in the Cancun Summit. Okay, and also the earlier pledge of trying to raise $100 billion per year up to 2020 was included in this decision also. Along with this, we also find a process to design a Green Climate Fund, the GCF, under the Conference of Parties. Okay, under the COP itself, a fund was supposed to be designed, named as the Green Climate Fund. Okay, this fund materialized later, but that idea or that a process to design such a fund started in the Cancun Summit. Clear? Along with that, a Cancun Adaptation Framework was made, which basically includes all kinds of climatic actions that could, prevent the climate change or decelerate the climate change, etc., etc. Okay, also the parties have established a technology mechanism with Technology Executive Committee and Climate Technology Center and Network to increase technology cooperation in support and on adaptation and mitigation. So funding is not enough. Proper technology transfer is also required. Correct. Developed countries have better R&D mechanisms, and they are way better in innovations and all. So whatever technology is being created, that has to be transferred to the developing countries also at a low cost. So technology transfer and funding both came to the priority in Cancun Summit. Okay, now what were the mechanisms of COP16? Okay, I told you there is a fund transfer and there is a technology transfer. Correct? So what were the mechanisms? First of all, technology transfer. Basically, it pledged that there would be enhanced action on technology development and transfer. More R&D will be done on technology development for cleaner, say cleaner fuels and similar things, and there will be measures to transfer this technology to the developing and underdeveloped countries. That is one. Second one, Green Climate Fund. This is the fund part, the finance part. Green Climate Fund was supposed to be set up as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the convention under Article 11. And it was supposed to help fund different programs and policies, etc., in developing country parties. And the fund was governed by the GCF board, the Green Climate Fund board. World Bank was invited by the COP to serve as the interim trustee. Okay, subject to review at the end of 3 years after operationalization of fund. Clear? After the operationalization of the fund, after 3 years, there was supposed to be a review. Until then, the World Bank was supposed to be the interim trustee of this GCF. Okay, the COP also decided that an independent secretariat will support the operation of the fund. And the COP also decided that GCF was supposed to be designed by a transition committee. Clear? So these were the mechanisms under COP16, along with Adaptation Fund. This was another funding mechanism, not the like the GCF. This is something else. What is this Adaptation Fund? This was supposed to finance concrete adaptation projects and programs in the developing country parties. Okay, so the Adaptation Fund is financed from the share of proceeds on the Clean Development Mechanism project activities and other sourcing funding. The share of the proceeds amounts to 2% of the certified emission reductions issued for a CDM project activity. So Adaptation Fund is nothing but another global fund pool which was supposed to be used for helping the developing nations in adapting to the climate change, in developing mechanisms and projects for adapting to the climate change. Okay, so this was again a monetary benefit, say financial mechanism for the betterment of developing countries, set up by the developed countries. Okay, so this was supervised and managed by Adaptation Fund Board, AFB, and this was composed by 16 members and 16 alternates and meets at least twice a year. This is the composition, 16 members and 16 alternates, and they meet twice a year. Upon invitation from the parties, the Global Environmental Facility, or GEF, provides secretariat services to the AFP. And here also World Bank is a trustee for an interim basis. Okay, for both the the Global Climate Fund GCF, Green Climate Fund GCF, and for the Adaptation Fund, World Bank itself is the interim trustee. Okay, so these were the mechanisms under COP16, or the very famous Cancun Summit. After the Cancun Summit came the Durban Summit, or the COP17. Okay, so COP is what was the action or agenda of COP17? So things were looking not so good for the developing countries because the developed countries started putting a lot of pressure. Okay, it cannot be just us who are doing everything. Developing countries also should come up with or also should be given fixed agendas and fixed targets, etc., etc., fixed commitments, so and so. Clear. So there was a lot of tug of war between developing nations and developed countries. India, a party to this summit, India, when went to Durban, India had two major demands. First of all, the principle of equity to remain intact. Second one, the any new climate regime, and this new climate regime deal should be launched after 2020. Okay, so what are the major demands of India? First of all, equity remain intact. The principle of equity. What is principle of equity? Principle of equity means it's the basis of the CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility. Those who have exploited and industrialized and polluted the environment and has led to all this in the first place, they should have more responsibility compared to the other countries which have not used as much or which have not got an opportunity to become industrialized as the others. This is the principle of equity. So based on how much they have, how much they are responsible, the commitments should also be accordingly, or according to that parity. It should not be like that US and India should have equal commitments. No, US has polluted more. It has used, it has taken the perks of industrialization more. So US should have higher commitments compared to India. Okay, so that is an example of the principle of equity. So India's demand was this principle of equity should remain intact. There should not be any question on that. And second, all the commitments will take place or come to force only after 2020. Up till then, nothing. India will not comply or say no obligation should be put on developing countries. And what was the outcome? Outcome was the new deal was finalized by supposed to be finalized by 2015, but it was launched only by 2020. So India's that demand was accepted. Second, the second phase of Kyoto Protocol was secured. Yes, in 2012 the first phase ended. The first commitment period ended. The second commitment period started from that period onwards. Okay, that was arranged in Durban Summit. Green Climate Fund was finally launched. This was designed on the previous one, Cancun Summit, but it was finally launched in the Durban Summit. Okay, Equity Fund finds place back in future climate talks. Again, that was another demand of India. The principle of equity that also was met. Adaptation mechanisms, transparency mechanism. Okay, it's not enough to say that we are doing that, we are doing this, etc., etc. Some proper transparency mechanism was supposed to be there to legitimize all these things. So that was secured. Secure 10 years of economic growth without carbon containment and intellectual property rights and technology not as well anchored in the New Deal. So for a 10-year period, these developing countries should be allowed development without any kind of carbon containment measures and all. After that, everybody has to come up with their own say limitations, commitments, etc., etc. Loopholes for the developed world was not fully blocked. This was a major issue. Okay, still the developed countries had this opportunity to circumvent some of the rules because some of them had a lot of big loopholes. Agriculture was brought by the developed nations under the climate change. This was again a major pushback or a drawback for the developing countries. Why? Because in most of the developing and underdeveloped countries, agriculture is the primary occupation. And so far, agriculture was kept out of this climate change issue. But developed countries finally were able to bring agriculture into the picture of climate change. All this happened in the COP17 or Durban Summit. After Durban came the Doha Outcomes. COP18, which happened in 2012. That is the Doha Summit. Okay, so what happened in Doha? I know that this slide is a bit congested. Don't worry about it. I will upload this slide in the Telegram channel. You can download it from there and study. I know that this is a very dry class, boring obviously, because all these are different summits and conferences and their reports and their outcomes, etc., etc. Clear, a very dry topic, I know that, but again, very important for UPSC. So please do have an idea. So what are the Doha commitments and what is the Doha Summit? Governments agreed to work together a universal climate change agreed by 2015, covering all countries which will come into effect from 2020. So that everybody is now working towards 2015. Something has to happen in 2015. A global climate change agreement should take place in 2015. So preparations were started way back in Doha or even before that itself. Kyoto Protocol was amended. 8-year second commitment period starting from January 1st, 2013 came into force. Okay, the first commitment period ended in 2012. So from January 1, 2013, second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol started for 8 years up to 2020. Okay, clean development mechanism, joint implementation, international emission trading, all that continued. No change in all that. All those were supposed to be continued. A key element was added to the measurement, reporting and verification framework for developed countries with the adoption of tables for the biennial reports known as common tabular format, thereby strengthening transparency and accountability regime. So I already told you that there were mechanisms in place for increasing transparency, for verification of the claims and all. But now a proper amendment was made such that in the measurement, reporting and verification, in the MRV framework, new something called a common tabular format was added, so that the transparency is much more opened up. Clear. Surplus assigned amount units, AAUs. Assigned amount units are known as AAUs. The surplus AAUs can be carried over without limits from the first to the second commitment period. So I told you that all the using these mechanisms, some credits were given to all the developed countries. They could emit that much anyway. Correct? Such credits were initially given. So if some country has managed to create some surplus in that area by reducing their emissions even more or something like that, then this surplus was allowed to be carried on to the second commitment period also. It doesn't expire. It can be carried forward. Okay, so that was also agreed upon on Doha outcomes. Completion of new infrastructure to channel technology and financial development. Yes, Songdo, the Republic of South Korea, will be the host of Green Climate Fund. Okay, a place known as Songdo in Republic of South Korea was supposed to be the host of Green Climate Fund. That was also decided in Doha. UNEP-led consortium will be host of the Climate Technology Center. GCF is the funding part. Technology part is the CTC, Climate Technology Center. And UNEP-led consortium will take care of the CTC. Clear? So all these agreements were made in Doha. Now, after Doha in 2012, later in 2013 came the COP19, the Warsaw Outcomes. Okay, what is the Warsaw Pact? Not the other one. There is a historical Warsaw Pact related to Cold War and etc. But we are talking about the Warsaw Summit or the environmental angle. Okay, so in Warsaw, the governments advanced the timeline for the development of 2015 agreement. So it has started for a while. Okay, it has been there for a while since say as early as say Copenhagen onwards. Everybody is looking into 2015. Okay, 2015 was supposed to be the year where a very critical agreement was supposed to be made. Clear? And all kinds of actions were taken in order to make this happen. Clear? So nationally determined contributions would be put forward in a clear and transparent manner. Yesterday I told you what this is. NDC, nationally determined contributions. Governments resolved to strengthen measures to close the ambition gap. What is this ambition gap? Ambition gap is a gap between what has been pledged to date and what is required to keep the world below the maximum average increase of 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, I mean the countries has pledged something. Okay, but that may not be enough to keep the global temperature from going above more than 2 degrees Celsius. by the end of this century. So what is being pledged and what more needs to happen? That gap is known as ambition gap. And ambition gap was taken into concern, and the governments resolved to strengthen their measures to close this gap. Clear? Before the agreement enters into force in 2020. Governments urge the voluntary cancellation of certified emission reductions. Okay, say some countries which are already achieving, or say who are very much on track or having surplus of emission trading, etc., etc. These governments urge them to voluntarily drop it. Don't carry forward it, or do not keep it. Just drop it out and try to reduce even more. Otherwise, they have the ability to reduce even more, but they do not have the obligation. Clear? And that will not result in anything good, because they will obviously use that extra as buffer. Okay, so remove that buffer and continue your reductions. Also, strengthening efforts to mobilize $100 billion by 2020. That funding target was also reiterated. The Green Climate Fund is open for business and will begin its operation in the middle of 2014. So it was set up in Durban, and now in Warsaw it was mobilized. Opened. Okay, it was supposed to be mobilized from the next year. Cutting emissions from deforestation. That's the Warsaw framework for RED+. Okay, RED+ basically deals with deforestation. So in Warsaw, another vision was taken to reduce the emissions due to deforestation. What happens when deforestation happens? A lot of carbon sink is being vanished. Correct. So that is basically extra emission, or those emissions which used to be absorbed by these forests are not anymore absorbed. Clear? So that is basically extra emission. So here in Warsaw, there were a framework was created for RED+ to reduce deforestation and cutting down emissions. Okay. Now, developed countries met the target capitalization of $100 million for Adaptation Fund. At Warsaw, the Adaptation Fund, which was constituted by $100 million, not billion, million. This was finally met by the developed countries. Okay, the fund came into existence, and the $100 million was, financed by the developed countries. The framework for measuring, reporting, and verifying mitigation efforts, including by the developing countries, is now fully operational. CTCN is ready to respond to requests from developing countries on issues related to the development and transfer of technology. I hope you remember what CTCN is. In the previous slide, we saw what that is. Okay, the Climate Technology Center, that also came into full operation, and it was ready to help developing countries with adoption of technology and transfer of technology. Clear? These were the impact of, or the outcomes of, Warsaw. So now it is 2013. Next comes in 2014, the very famous Lima Summit. Okay, I know that this is too much information for a single class. That is, but this is a very lengthy chapter, and if I try to finish this, there is much more than all this. Okay, so we will finish by 2017, or 3 more years we will look into, and at that we will break it today. The remaining we will take in the next class. All right. So Lima Outcomes. What are the Lima Outcomes? COP20. Okay. Lima Outcome, or the Lima Climate Conference, is very famous for a lot of firsts. It is the first summit based on a lot of things. Okay. First of all, Lima conference pledges were in the Lima conference. Pledges were made by both developed and developing countries prior to and during the COP that took the capitalization of the new Green Climate Fund past an initial $10 billion targets. Okay, during the conference and before the conference started itself, both developing and developed countries made pledges, thereby taking the initial funding way beyond $10 billion. Initial funding was supposed to be $10 billion for the GCF, but commitments were, or pledges were made by both developed and developing countries that it was, the fund was already, achieved even before the conference, completed. Okay, levels of transparency and confidence building reached new heights as several industrialized countries submitted themselves to questioning about their emission targets under the new process called multilateral assessment. In the previous conferences, we discussed some techniques or some measures taken for transparency and proper validation of claims and all, correct? Verification and validation. So here, many of the industrialized countries submitted themselves to questioning. And this was based on a new process known as multilateral assessment. This is, a huge confidence boost of mutual trust and all. Okay, so Lima became a very, in this regard, Lima was a very successful summit. Lima Ministerial Declaration on Education and Awareness, came into being, raising calls on governments to put climate change into school curricula and climate awareness into national development plans. It is necessary to put, educate people regarding climate change. So put it in your school curricula. Also take national development plans with respect to climate awareness. Okay, that was what was set up in Lima Ministerial Declaration on Education and Awareness. A national adaptation, different countries were asked or implored to look up into the national adaptation plans. A NAP global network was launched involving Peru, US, Germany, Philippines, Togo, UK, Jamaica, and Japan. This is the NAP global network initially. Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative was taken. This was basically a pilot project in the Andes under the Nairobi work program, underlined that establishing the adaptive needs of communities can be successfully captured. Clear. So again, this project was a pilot project in Andes, and this was successful. So replicate this result in other parts of the world also. That was the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative. Based on successful models in some parts of the world, try to replicate or imitate these projects in other parts, so they can also achieve success with some variations based on the region. Okay, so that was the ideology of Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative. Now, Lima work program on gender. Lima conference was a huge success because of a lot of reasons. It's not just about climate. It also looked into equality, gender equality. The Lima conference agreed a Lima work program on gender to advance gender balance and to promote gender sensitivity in developing and implementing climate policy. How much role can women play when it comes to climate change and adapting to climate change? Clear? So a work program was set up on gender. UNFCCC NAMA. What is this NAMA? What are NAMAs? NAMAs are plans of developing countries to reduce emissions and to develop sustainably, which can be supported by developed countries. Okay, basically plans of developing countries to reduce emissions. These are known as NAMAs. Okay, full form is Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions. So UNFCCC observed a NAMA Day as a part of this. Finally, climate action on the ground celebrated by UN. UNFCCC's Secretariat Momentum for Change Initiative presented awards to representatives of some of the best examples of climate solutions in the world, which inspired increased climate action. So lots of awards based on good performances were distributed by UNFCCC, and this initiative was known as Momentum for Climate Initiative Award. Okay, and for the first time, a new category known as Information and Communication Technology, ICT, was also added in the award section. Okay, so all these happened in Lima. And after Lima came the historic conference, that is the Paris Climate Change Conference, COP21 2015. Everybody was working towards this conference until this point of time. Finally, in 2015, the historic conference, the Paris Climate Conference, took place. I think, this was all over the newspapers. This was the main news at that time in almost every single newspaper. Paris climate change. I hope you might even remember reading about this in newspapers. So what was this agreements in agreements in Paris Climate Conference? To hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrialized levels. correct? Compared to the pre-industrialized era. What was it? If the temperature in the pre-industrialized era was say 30 degrees Celsius, suppose example, then the temperature by the end of this century, by 2100, should not exceed 32 degrees Celsius. That change in temperature should be well below 2 degrees Celsius. Got it? These are example numbers, not the real numbers. Whatever was the temperature in the pre-industrialized era, the temperature should not exceed more than 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. Okay. Also, to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrialized levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impact of climate change. Not only that we are trying to keep it under 2 degrees Celsius, but we are trying to cap it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. These were the targets set under Paris Conference. And the concept of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, were again reiterated and put into action. In 2018, parties will take stock of the collective efforts in relation to progress towards the goals set in Paris Agreement and to inform preparations on NDCs. The conference ended in 2015 itself, but 3-year time was given for formulating the nationally determined contributions to achieve this goal. Also, after 3 years, a stock was to be taken. An overall assessment has to be made on what is the progress of all these things. Clear. Also, there will be a global stock take every 5 years to assess the collective progress. It's not just enough to keep targets and work towards it. It's also important to evaluate it at equal intervals. So at the end of each 5 years, an evaluation will be made on how much we are collectively progressing towards achieving these goals. Clear? Now, the first session of the COP, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, CMA-1, took place in Marrakesh, Morocco, the next year. Okay, so until now we have the COP1, COP2, COP3, up to COP21. And this continues, Conference of Parties continues, COP22, 23, 24, goes on. Recently we had COP26 in Glasgow. Okay, so that goes on. But from Paris onwards, we started something new known as Meeting of Parties. Okay, this is known as CMA. So the first meeting of parties happened in Marrakesh in 2016. Clear? So from that year, we count CMA also. CMA1, CMA2, CMA3, like that. These were the main, decisions in Paris Climate Conference 2015. And in 2016 came the Marrakesh Conference. In the Marrakesh Conference, the SBCSTA began considering how to account for the public finance. In the previous, conferences, it was agreed that $100 billion per year has to be raised for funding climate, green technologies and helping the developing countries to, evolve. Correct. So how to fund or how to raise public finance for this? This was the main question. Also, the parties began discussing how to structure the stock take, including the format, input, timeline, duration, output, all these things. In Paris, all these kinds of targets were set. How to get all these things? Implementation, structuring, all these things were done in Marrakesh. But in Marrakesh, there was a hugely contentious issue known as the orphan issues. Very highly contested issue. What is this orphan issue? Basically, whether to establish common timeframes for NDCs. This was the issue. There are nationally determined contributions, correct? NDCs. So, should these NDCs have a common time frame or not? That was the major issue. Initially, the parties adopted different time frames for the first round. Developed countries had an earlier time frame and other developing countries had a comparatively looser time frame. Okay, but now developed countries pressed that all of them should have stricter common time frame. This was not agreed by developing countries. Clear? So all these were the main issues in Marrakesh and came to be known as the orphan issues. Adaptation Fund. Although developed countries would prefer to channel support through this, Green Climate Fund, developing countries pushed very hard to keep the Adaptation Fund alive. This was another issue. Once GCF came into force and once it was mobilized, there was no need for two funds, Adaptation Fund and GCF. Why? So the developed countries tried to do away with Adaptation Fund because they are the ones funding it, correct? So they said that all the funding will go to the GCF. No need for Adaptation Fund. But the developing countries who were already benefiting from the Adaptation Fund, they did not want to do that. They pressed to keep this Adaptation Fund alive. Clear? So these were the contentions in Marrakesh Climate Change Conference held in Morocco in 2016. And the Paris Agreement encourages countries to prepare and submit long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, outlining the kinds of actions needed to achieve much deeper emission reductions. In Marrakesh, Canada, Germany, Mexico, and the US, these four countries became the first countries to submit what have come to be known as mid-century strategies. And a new initiative called 2050 Pathway Platform was launched. Okay, in Paris, these countries were encouraged to submit some long-term strategies for adaptation and for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and all. The next year in Marrakesh, four countries, Canada, Germany, US, and Mexico, they came up with proper pathways, strategies to do this. And these four countries became the first in the world to prepare such mid-century strategies. And this came to be known as the 2050 Pathway Platform. A new initiative known as 2050 Pathway Platform was created. Developing countries released a roadmap outlining how they foresee meeting the global goal of mobilizing 100 billion a year in public and private finance for developing countries by 2020. So I already told you these developed countries were supposed to finance green projects in developing countries, correct? So for that, $100 billion fund was supposed to be created. So at Marrakesh, these developed countries realized a roadmap to, finance this fund. Okay, a roadmap was created on how to finance or how to, put together such a huge fund for the developing countries. Finally, parties conducted the first review of the Warsaw International Mechanism for loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. So because of the climate changes that are happening in various parts of the world, there are lots of losses and damages, especially in poorer countries. Okay, so all this was kept in the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And at Marrakesh, the parties conducted the first review of this WIM, Warsaw International Mechanism. Clear? And last topic for the day, the Bonn Convention, the Bonn Climate Change Conference, or the COP23 2017. So this climate conference at Bonn, which is actually in Germany, is very important, or say it is very peculiar in a lot of sense. First of all, Fiji was the presiding country at COP23. And Fiji is the first small island state to host a UNFCCC climate talk. Okay, so that was the main attraction of this. First of all, there were plenty of, plenty of commitments and plenty of, agreements, etc., plenty of talks on various issues. Most importantly, powering past coal alliance. This was actually launched in COP23, led by UK and Canada. It has more than 20 members aimed at accelerating clean growth and achieving the rapid phase out of traditional coal power. Okay, this was a coalition trying to phase out the use of coal power as a power source. And the alliance declares that the coal phase out is required in the OECD and the EU 28 by 2030. By the year 2030, European Union and the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, both these were supposed to phase out the use of coal as a power source. And not later than by 2050, the rest of the world also should meet the Paris Agreement. Okay, in order to meet the Paris Agreement, by 2030, both the European Union, the EU 28, and OECD countries should phase out coal. And not later than 2050, the rest of the countries also should do the same. Only then can we meet the Paris Agreement. This was put forth by the Bonn climate in the Bonn climate change by UK and Canada, a coalition led by UK and Canada. Because Fiji was hosting this the presidency of this climate conference, certain other peculiar topics were also discussed. First one, gender action plan. Earlier I told you in one of the previous conferences also this gender action plan was looked upon, and the gender action plan highlighting the role of women in climate action and promoting gender equality was taken into process at Bonn. Similarly, local communities and indigenous people platform. So expertise of the local communities and indigenous ideas, etc., were also taken into consideration for implementing a mitigation or adaptation mechanism. Finally, Ocean Pathway Partnership. This is a two-track strategy for 2020, supporting the goals of Paris Agreement that includes 1. Increasing the role of the ocean consideration in UNFCCC process, and significantly increasing action in priority areas impacting or impacted by the ocean and climate change. So what is the relationship between climate change and ocean? Okay, ocean has a huge role to play in climate change. So ocean specific pathway was mapped under the Ocean Pathway Partnership. Clear? So these were also contributions in the Bonn Climate Change Conference of 2017. And the most important part is the Talanoa Dialogue. What is Talanoa? Talanoa is actually a traditional word used in Fiji and across the Pacific to reflect a process of inclusive, participatory, and transparent dialogue. Okay, this is a local term, Talanoa. So this Talanoa Dialogue is a process designed to help countries implement and enhance their nationally determined contributions by 2020. All these countries have this voluntary nationally determined contributions, NDCs, correct? So this dialogue was something that could help and enhance the NDCs by 2020. This focused on sharing ideas and skills and experiences through storytelling, etc., etc. So this was something of something very specific to the fact that Fiji was the presiding country. Okay, so that dialogue also came to be known as Talanoa Dialogue. INSU Resilience Global Partnership for Climate and Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance Solutions. This is another coalition which was launched at UN Climate Conference in Bonn, bringing together the G20 countries in partnership with the B20 nations, along with civil society, international organizations, academia, etc., etc. So what are the G20 countries? What are these B20 nations? B20 countries means vulnerable 20. It actually includes a group of 49 of the most vulnerable countries. It's not 20 countries, it's actually 49 countries. Okay, it aims to increase the number of poor and vulnerable people in developing countries benefiting from the direct or indirect insurance by up to 400 million by 2020. So by the year 2020, those who are affected, those poor, vulnerable people in developing and underdeveloped countries should be benefited through some sort of insurance program. Okay, insurance coverage has to be increased by up to 400 million by the end of 2020. That was what was the target of INSU Resilience Global Partnership. Okay, and finally, it was decided that the next COP24, will happen in Katowice in Poland in the year 2018. Okay, so that up to 2017, that is the Bonn Convention. We have looked into Bonn Conference. We have completed today. So tomorrow we will take up the rest. But I think the rest is basically in the current affairs area. So you can find it out yourself also. So please do look into it. the Katowice conference up to the Glasgow, which ended very recently in 2021. That is COP26. Okay, so COP24, 25 and 26. Find it out yourself. Do some research on your own, because those are current affairs areas also. So more and more important than whatever I have taught you up till now. So using this as a background, please research on those three and study those three much more than this in detail, because there's a better chance that these three will come in UPSC in as some sort of question, prelims or mains or whatever. Okay, so please do look into them. We will complete this chapter tomorrow. There are a lot more area to complete. There are other mechanisms also. In today's class, we only looked into one mechanism, that is COP, Conference of Parties. We started all the way from the Kyoto Protocol, the establishment of UNFCCC up to 2017, COP23. The next one onwards, that is the entire crux of COP, the Conference of Parties. There are other mechanisms also. Okay, all those we will look into in the tomorrow's class. Okay, so I know that this was a very very highly dry kind of topic and boring topic to be honest. And but please do study. These are important. The main environment area, the biodiversity and those interesting areas are actually over. Now we have to study some of these high theory areas, but these are necessary anyway, so please do study them. And that's it for today. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel and share with your friends. I will upload the notes in my Telegram channel. You can download it and use it for revision. Okay, so we will meet again tomorrow. There will be maximum 5 more lectures on environment and we will be done by that. For CSAT, there will be 2 more lectures and that's it. Okay, so hopefully by the year end, we will finish all these things and you can start your revisions for all these topics from Jan 1st, 2022. All right, so that is goodbye for today. See you again tomorrow. Until then, bye-bye.